Hello my brothers and sisters in Christ all over the world. We go live again today as usual, but what I'm sharing today is totally unusual. I wanted to talk about this last Saturday, but things happened and I just couldn't make it. I mentioned it also in one of my previous videos that I wanted to make a documentary about this, which would show you basically why we are where we are in the world and why we're facing such economic downturn in the world, depression, terrorism, censorship, restrictions of movement, restrictions of our freedoms taken away basically, and freedom of expression, the Russian-Ukraine crisis, biological weapon attacks, and all those kind of things are the results and effects of one conspiracy of the powers that be that took place 43 years ago. I wanted to make a documentary about that, but knowing myself, I'm a kind of a perfectionist. I wanted to make that video perfect, and I haven't even started to scratch the surface even, but because things are escalating in the world, in fact, not just in a particular country, I felt compelled to just talk about this now as things are escalating and things are getting things are changing by the minute. So you need to be aware of all these things as they are shutting down our way of communication. Now, what's happening is that right now as we speak, a revolution is taking place. A revolution is unfolding in the country of Iran. Now, Iran, if you have been watching my videos, have been following me for the last few years, you would know that I made a series of videos titled What's Behind COVID, and in one of the episodes of those series I mentioned Iran as being one of the important countries in the world, a role player, a key country, and that whether we like it or not, it has an effect of what and how we live around the world. It is important geographically, it is important geopolitically. The peace and security, stability of the world depends on the peace of Iran. And Iran has been anything but peaceful for the last 43 years. Why do I say 43 years? For those of you who don't know, who are not aware of the world history that much, prior to 43 years ago, Iranians had their own monarchy under the reign of Pahlavi, and the king was overthrown by the powers that be, by the globalists, not by the Iranians as they want you and I to believe, as the powers, the globalists, then conspired with Jimmy Carter, the Democrat president at the time then in America, and Mr. Callahan being the Prime Minister in Britain, the German Chancellor, I don't know the name, and the French President at the time. They all conspired against him, though Iran was the closest ally to the West, particularly America, in the Middle East. The closest ally, and Shah had developed the country over his 35 years of reign to the point that the country was one of the top countries in the world in every area: culture, industry, agriculture, technology, you name it, economy, and Iran was giving a helping hand to the Western powers when they were in need, such as Britain. When they were in economic crisis, Iran lent millions of pounds to them to bail them out. But all that didn't stop the globalists to infiltrate inside the country their own media, their own people who loved him dearly, and topple him. Removing a highly educated king who had worked and served his people and the world, brought security, stability, peace to the region, was instrumental in bringing peace between Arab countries and Israel, was closest ally in the region for the Western powers, and in particular America, as I said, and all that, and all the services that he did for many countries to bring peace and stability and security to their countries. And even the world leaders were going to him for advice, for help, for borrowing money, for a lot of things that he helped. However, they infiltrated, they conspired against him. A few times they tried to kill him, and they didn't manage. And in the end, they managed through their media and some minority in Iran to topple him. And when I say topple, they basically caused him to leave the country. He was a gentleman who didn't want to keep his throne on bloodshed. So as soon as he saw people were shouting against him and didn't want him, he left the country. Now there's a lot to say about that, as he left the country, how many times they wanted, even Jimmy Carter, who claimed to be his closest friend, just prior to that event, betrayed him completely and wanted to turn him to the Mullahs so he could be killed. But however, he managed to kill him with the help of others. The series of doctors doing deliberately or unintentionally mistakes with his illness at the time, and finally causing him to die. Meanwhile, in Iran, Mullahs had taken over the power, and as he predicted in his book titled The Answer to the History, that Shah wrote this book, and I'll put a link to that book in the description of this video once this video comes off streaming and gets published, so you can read that how many things he predicted in his book that we now face today, including biological warfare, and that the Third World War would be biological, including the economical issues that we face today in the West, including what he called as the Great Horror that we face today. He said after him, with these mullahs in charge of Iran, the world will have to face the Great Horror. And we have been doing that without actually pointing the finger at a particular country. Well, this is the point I'm trying to make. This is the country. Now, don't get me wrong, people are out in the streets. They have been out from the beginning, from the conception of this regime, people have opposed it, and they have been suppressed every time. Their voices have been suppressed, their voices haven't been heard by the world, and if any media ever mentioned them, they mentioned it on the various reasons, like there was some protests against fuel prices, there were some protests for people not having jobs, those kind of things, totally irrelevant, although they were part of the protest, but they weren't the main reason why people were out. People were out and have been out for the last decade or so, and they have been clearly shouting they don't want this regime altogether. And funnily enough, they do shout what they want as well. They want the Shah's son back, because the Shah wants out of the country and in exile. He was asked to resign and he never resigned, and his son is the crown prince of Iranians, and majority of the people in Iran want him back, who now lives in America with his family. They want him back simply because they've seen his activities over the past 43 years. He's been highly active, and they've seen his father's services to the country and the world, and they've seen his grandfather's services to the country and the world, and so they love him, and they love him to go back and take over. However, America, as I believe, have restricted him, basically the same as a person like me with not many fans or influence in the world have been restricted. You can imagine how much more he's been restricted and censored. However, Iranian government hasn't been inactive either. The Iranian Islamic regime has created some fake oppositions inside and outside the country, elements and agents of its own government who are posing as opposition members and opposition leaders, but people are now aware of all that, and more than ever and stronger than ever they're now in the streets, and they have united this time. They were out a couple of years ago and there were protests. Millions of people were in the streets again throughout the country protesting a couple of years ago, and with the help of the Western media, the whole thing got suppressed. Armed forces went out and killed, according to their own figures, around 5,000 people, shooting them in the heads and chests. Some of them were taken to jails and tortured, raped and killed. Did you hear any of those in your media? I bet you didn't. And if you did, like I said, they would tell you it was all about fuel prices, it was all about scarves, it was all about hijab and this and that, which are all irrelevant things. People of Iran shouted then, as they're shouting today, that we do not want the Islamic regime. It cannot be any clearer than that. And they're shouting Pahlavi's name as their king. However, none of this has been broadcast, none of them has been mentioned in any news, and You might ask, so how is this relevant to me? Okay, I'll tell you how. What happened in Iran 43 years ago started to happen in America and the rest of the world since 2020. Election fraud happened in Iran years ago. It became part of the system, part of the norm. The same thing has been happening in the world, the rest of the world. Terrorism, the root of the export of terrorism is from Iran. And please don't confuse the Iranians with the Iranian regime, because the Iranian regime and its forces are the minority. Iranians are the majority. They don't want the regime or the system, and the system has caused millions of Iranians, mostly highly educated and skilled Iranians, to flee the country and go to other countries to reside and live and work. Those millions outside the country also have been protesting. They have gathered around the Iranian embassies around the world in different countries. You might know, you might be close to one of those, and you might have seen the protests yourself. And if you have, please put a comment there so we know more about these things and people know about these things. Toronto, thousands and thousands of people protested against the Islamic regime in front of their embassy. People gathered in front of the United Nations building in America and protested, including the Prince himself. People, thousands of people, gathered in front of the Iranian embassy in London and tried to even take over the embassy. And there were clashes between them and the police. Then they went and put their original flag with the lion and sun in the middle of the flag, which is their monarchy sign and symbol, on top of the Islamic Center in London, which is part of the Iranian regime. But none of this was showed or broadcast on any news media. Did you see any of these? These are important things, important events. It's now climaxed to the point of irreversible point. It's now irreversible for the government and irreversible for the people. They can't go back on anything. They can only go forward, and it will end in a complete revolution to take down the Mullahs and replace them with a secular government, which is what the people of Iran want. Now, this is where you need to be careful, because Western powers, the globalists who removed the Shah with their conspiracies and put in place an uneducated mullah in power of a rather large country with large resources, they wouldn't want his son now to go back and take over. They've spent billions. They fed Khomeini millions of dollars as he was residing in France and ordering people to go into the streets and take over the power in Iran, America dished out millions of dollars to him under Jimmy Carter. Now, those people who did this, those powers who wanted that and spent that much money, that much resources to do this, to keep the mullahs in power for 43 years, they're not going to just give in and let Shah's son now go back there and rule. Because what would have they achieved? They would have lost everything that they've tried to do all these last 43 years. So what they do now is they work and they are funding their the Islamic regime's agents outside the country, posing as opposition leaders. And so once the Iranians manage to topple the Islamic regime, then they would try to bring these people into power, so they have their own fingers there again. And they might just remove the name Islamic from the Republic of Iran and just keep it Republic of Iran. But that's not what the people of Iran want. But the globalists want that. However, I want you to be aware and watch closely what's happening in Iran. What's been happening in Iran for the last 43 years is only a shadow of what's coming to us in the West. Anything that you saw there, terrorism, censorship, taking away people's freedom of expression, restrictions over restrictions, all that has been happening in the last few years in the West. Economic pressure has been happening. Rigging the votes in elections has become normal in Iran for the last 4 decades, and it's been happening now in the West for the last few years at least that we know of. Rising cost of living only been in the news or the talk of the news in the last few months, or let's say last year or so in the West. What has been happening there at least for the past 3 years. The same with the cost of fuel, although Iran is one of the major fuel or oil producers in the world. Protests also have been happening around the world in the last year or so around the world, but it's been happening in Iran for the past few years, to say the least. Major protests against the policies of the government. Economic depression, sharp decline in the value of the currencies around the world, theft, the rate of suicide, the rate of divorce, fake man-made earthquakes, flooding, drought in various places, fake food, and many other events, big events, major issues that have been happening in the world. They first happened in Iran. Insecurity of people in their own homes and businesses are also other issues that will be next if the greedy globalists win in the battle in Iran. You might say, well, people have been out in the streets before in Iran and they couldn't topple their regime. That's true, and as I've mentioned before, every time they've been out, they were suppressed by their government, by their heavily armed forces, and they were killed either in the streets by being shot in the heads and chests, or in their jails after being tortured and raped. But this time They are more united, they are stronger, the number of people going out are far more than the previous uprisings, but most importantly this time they don't expect any help from the outside governments of the countries, because the previous times when they went to the streets and had an uprising and they were protest and they were trying to topple the regime, they couldn't, because they were expecting the world media to broadcast their voices, but their voices weren't heard, and if it was broadcast, it was all distorted and not the real news was broadcast. In 2009 also they had the same kind of uprising in Iran, but again as an indication, people shouted then, Obama, are you with them or with us? With them meaning the government. So that just indicates that they were expecting help from outside. But Obama, of course, was with the mullahs. And not only that, he dished out some money, cash, to the mullahs to support them. Now, though the internet in Iran is shut down, so people cannot even communicate with each other inside or outside to know where they are, where they're gathering, where they're going to go next, and all those kind of things. And they're controlling them. The cyber police is controlling them, monitoring them. However, this time they're not relying on internet at all. They've done away with it. They've put that all aside, and they have no expectations from foreign governments. Zero. They're relying on their own hands and feet and their own strength and their own words. They've gone to the streets, and some of them, they've had clashes with the police. They've burnt down some of the police stations. They've captured in some areas and seized some of their weapons, which ironically, the videos that have leaked out, it shows that people are showing taser guns seized from the police that has the American flag printed on it, tear gas shells that has made in England written on it, which is all ironic because the Iranian government is supposed to be sanctioned and none of these things should be even reached to them. And that just indicates the Western powers are much happier with mullahs in power in Iran than any other secular government. Why? Because they can rape the country, they can loot the country, and they can basically use it as and when they want. It's not in their interest for the Iranians to have freedom, to have a secular government, to have a government or a king, even worse, that they love. They won't want that. So what does all this mean to me or to you? As I said, what's happened in Iran has happened in the West later on. So watch closely. What's happening in Iran will happen to the world. If the battleground now, the battleground of the powers that be, the center battleground is literally in Iran, which is literally the center of the world. And if the battle is won by the people, then I bet you the people of the world have a revolution. You and I will win wherever we are in the world, whichever country you are. But if the globalists, God forbid, win, then you have to watch your space. But I doubt the way things are escalating in Iran, the globalists have been confused. Iranians have confused the globalists, which is the main reason they're not even talking about Iran or Iranians inside the country. Their uprising, their protests, their voices, they don't want the rest of the world to hear them. And they're not even talking about the Iranians outside the country, where they're residing in any country and they have had their protests against their own embassy in that country. For instance, in France, in Paris, in London, in Toronto. These are major cities, major protests. Other countries like Denmark, like Italy, Switzerland, other places also protests have taken place in front of their in front of the Iranian embassy, and some of them have erupted into clashes between the police and people. However, none of that is mentioned. Why? Because the globalists don't know how to channel that in their own benefit. They don't know what to do with it. They didn't expect any of this. So what can we do to stop all these evil events that have already taken place in Iran from happening to us wherever we may be? Well, first of all, we need to pray that the Iranians will win this battle. Iranians will topple the Iranian Islamic terrorist brutal regime and bring down the mullahs from the power forever, for good. And then with an election or a referendum, they will choose what government or what kind of government the real Iranian people want, not what the globalists want or dictate to them, but what the Iranians actually want, and choose their own government, a secular government that the Iranians would want, the Iranians themselves, for real, a real election, not something that is rigged or infiltrated by the powers outside or inside, and not by the powers that be installing their own puppets then, because that would just reset the whole scenario again back to 43 years ago, and we'll be back to zero. That won't benefit the Iranians or the world. It will just mean going back in time. And the second thing you can do is to write to your member of parliament, congressmen, members of the Senate, whoever, wherever you are, depending on where you are, write to them and ask them to be the voice of the Iranians in that government. Listen to their outcry and help them. They don't want your help, they don't expect your help, but help in a way that don't make love with the mullahs anymore. Because at the same time as the revolution is taking place in Iran, the Biden's regime also is making nuclear deal with Iran, with the mullahs. And that should not be. They should stop making love affairs with the mullahs, the Western powers, and maybe if they're really, really nice, they want to help, they can provide free internet so people can access internet, and so they can communicate with the rest of the world and themselves. As at the moment, they're restricted, and that's what they've done every time they shut the internet down. There is internet blackout in Iran, and so that's part of their technique to suppress the voices. And so the least you can do is to ask those people, those members of the government, your local government, to stop supporting the mullahs funding them while pretending that they have sanctioned the Islamic regime. Not that they don't already know. They already know them, their nature, because they have installed them, they know them fully well. But your letters, your emails, your contacting them means that more and more people in the world are actually aware of what's happening in the world. So they can't pull wool over our eyes any longer. That's the point you're trying to make. And this way, they'll be forced to make changes, at least to their policies. Well, I hope you're more enlightened than you were before watching this video. There's a lot to say, and I might make that video I was planning to make later on, but it won't be immediately. Things are happening, watch closely, and pray earnestly. Till next time and next video, God bless you and goodbye.